Okay. Problemi tecnici, of course. Poi, can you come one second? Yeah. Sì, non so. Allora, io lo posso vedere, cioè, però.
Non lo puoi mandare fuori? Hai fatto l'estensione perché deve essere duplicato.
Ok. Of course, computers don't work when you need them to work. Interesting. Well, hi everyone. Sorry for the technical issues. È full screen però. No, è bloccato. Vabbè, we'll do it. I think it's fine. We can do it like this. Lo so. I know. No spoilers. We don't like spoilers. Let's do it like this. This should be fine. We're hacking the computer live. Okay, I think this is fine. Okay, sorry for that. Hi everyone, buongiorno, welcome, and thanks for being here. I'm Lorenzo Franceschi-Bicchierai. I usually write about hackers, security, and digital rights for Motherboard, which is an online magazine, if you will, about tech and science. We're part of Vice Media. If you don't know Motherboard, I'm a little biased, but you should check it out. Before Motherboard, I was at Mashable, another website, and at Wired's Danger Room. If anyone remembers Danger Room, it was great. It's dead. Rest in peace. But before we begin, I would like to thank the organizers of the festival for inviting me, all the people that work really hard to make this happen. In particular, thanks to Claudio Agosti, who asked me to be here and brainstormed ideas with me on what to talk about. I also would like to thank my editor, Derek Mead, who encouraged me to be here, and thanks to my partner and Derek for helping me prepare this talk. Also, I have to say that it's a little bit strange to be here for me, because 50 years ago, my grandfather, who was also a journalist, used to come to this very hotel when he worked at Paese Sera, a newspaper that's also dead. So it's almost like closing the circle. So after this, I'm retiring, basically. So that's great for me. After this, I'm done. Anyway, enough about that. Let's talk about, and hopefully this works now. Okay, we're going to talk about leaks today. Specifically, leaks about large leaks of documents and information originating from hacks or cyber attacks, if you want to use that word. Cyber attacks, I don't like that word very much, but that's another story. We'll talk about it next time. So we'll talk about the fact that there's been a dramatic increase in hacks and subsequent leaks in the last few years. And that's, I think, has changed the way that we do journalism. A brief warning, I have to tell you, I'm going to raise a lot of questions today, and we'll try to answer some of those, but I don't have all the answers. Some of these questions will remain unanswered, and that's mostly because every situation is different, and it's just, we will have to treat everything differently. But hopefully we can lay out some good guidelines and try to figure out some common approaches for this. I also hope to leave 10 or 15 minutes at the end so you can ask any questions, and I'll try to answer them. But let's start with the story. It's June 14 of last year, and the Washington Post reports that the Russian government or Russian hackers have broken into the networks and computers of the Democratic National Committee, which is basically the Democratic Party. And the newspaper reports that the hackers stole all kinds of documents, including documents on Donald Trump and campaign documents, emails, basically everything you can imagine was in those computers. And the attack lasted months. So a security firm, CrowdStrike, which investigated the breach, says that the intruders are codenamed Fancy Bear and Cozy Bear, and they are actually hackers working for the Russian government. Specifically, Fancy Bear is the Russians' military intelligence, known as the GRU. I don't know how to pronounce that in Russian. And the other one is the KGB, or rather the hair of the KGB, known as the FSB. Here they are. So just so you know, that this causes some confusion. The Fancy Bear and Cozy Bear are just code names that CrowdStrike made up. Obviously, these groups don't call themselves this way. So it's just an industry code name. And as you can see here, every company calls them differently. APT28, Fancy Bear, Sophacy, it's all the same, GRU. APT29, Cozy Bear, the Dukes, whatever, it's probably FSB. Anyway, at this point, this is an interesting story, but it's not that shocking, right? Spies are gonna spy, it's their job, and hacking a political party during a campaign is just something we'd expect Russian spies to do. Spies are gonna spy. It's just 21st century espionage at this point. But it's what happens next in the next hours and then weeks and months that is unique, or rather, at least unique in the age of the internet. So on June 15, more or less 24 hours after the initial report of the hack, someone calling himself Guccifer 2.0 claims responsibility for the attack. He uses a WordPress blog like everyone else, and he calls himself a lone hacker and says that CrowdStrike is wrong, essentially implying I'm not Russian, it wasn't the Russian government, it was just me. And he also says, he has very colorful language. He says, quote, "Fuck the Illuminati and their conspiracies, fuck CrowdStrike," with 3,000 exclamation points. You know, just any other blogger. We all started as bloggers. So Guccifer 2 also actually, at this point everyone is like, okay, who is this guy? But he actually shows real documents, and he basically proving that he had at some point either access to the network or he got the documents from whoever had access to the network. So pretty credible in some ways. And he also says that he gave the documents to Wikileaks, which, as we all know, it's an organization founded by Julian Assange that collects and publishes leaked documents. And strangely, actually, Wikileaks tweets about the fact that Guccifer gave them documents, which is a little strange because Wikileaks has always done a really big deal of not talking about their sources. Their whole ethos is we don't talk about sources. Stuff comes to us, we just publish it. So that's a little bit strange. Anyway, this story is this is when it starts getting interesting. Guccifer says that he is just a lone hacker, he doesn't work for anyone, but his story crumbles pretty quickly. So even in the blog post that he published and the documents that he published the first day, there are clues and breadcrumbs and evidence that points to the fact that he actually might be Russian. So for example, you can see here he left some, on the right, he left some metadata suggesting that he used essentially a computer that had the Russian language set up. He also made some mistakes as using the 3 parentheses, which is a typical Russian smile instead of the classic colon and parentheses. He also, the other thing that in this first blog post was that some of these documents were handled on a pirated, like a downloaded version of Windows Office, which is actually very popular in Russia. So these are, people start to suspect that he's actually Russian. At that point, I was very skeptical. I write about this stuff all the time, and I just don't believe when people say, I did this, I hacked, whatever. Everyone hackers really like fame, and you have to be skeptical. So at this point, I approached Guccifer 2. I approached Guccifer 2 via Twitter, because he had a Twitter account as well, just like all of us, and tried to know more. And honestly, I didn't expect him to answer, but actually he did answer, so I asked him for an interview right away. This is how easy it was. I just said, I'm a reporter, can we chat? And he said, okay, let's try. And we spoke for like a couple of hours, I don't remember now, but his answers he was actually pretty slow at answering. But we spoke for a couple of hours, and his story just started to show a lot of weakness, even more than there was already. So, for example, he couldn't explain to me how he technically did the attack. He had a version of the story, but it didn't really make sense. And then I asked him about Russia, obviously. This was what I was really interested in. And he said that he hated being attributed to Russia. Here's some of his quotes. He said, I don't like being Russian. And he also said that he didn't care about Trump or Hillary. He couldn't care less about the US election. He said that all he cared was the Illuminati, which I don't know if you guys know, but it's sort of a boogeyman of a relatively popular conspiracy theory. And then when I asked him, so where are you from if you're not Russian? He said, I'm a Romanian hacker. I was like, okay, lots of Romanian hackers in the world, could be. He also said that he was a manager, a philosopher, a women lover, and of course he said he liked Gucci. Okay, so I didn't care too much about his fashion choices, so I thought, if this guy is Romanian, let's ask him something in Romanian. I don't speak Romanian, but with Google Translate, I just asked him very simple questions like, where are you from? How did you do the hack? And initially, he did answer in Romanian. Like, his answers were, from what I can understand, were Romanian. But after a while, he started growing impatient. He was like, why are you asking me all these questions? Is this like a school test? I don't have to prove to you that I speak Romanian, which I guess I understand. Maybe he's a busy hacker. But at that point, he was like, you know what, I have to go, bye-bye. And he stopped answering my questions. So I was a little bit turned off by that. And so I have a few friends that are Romanian and a few sources that are Romanian. So I was like, let's show them my interaction with Guccifer and see what they think about it. So I showed them the full transcript, which we eventually actually published on the website. And every Romanian I spoke with said, this is not how a Romanian speaks. Like, this is Romanian language, but this is not how I would speak. So for example, this is just a little example, but someone made a chart with Guccifer's Romanian and how we would actually speak. I don't know if anyone here is Romanian. I'm happy to, if you have any feedback. But everyone I spoke with basically was like, this guy is not a Romanian. Or he might speak Romanian, but isn't like as a second language, but he's not a Romanian hacker. So to recap, at this point we have a significant intrusion and attack against the DNC, the Democratic Party, a hacker who's leaking documents. The hacker says he's Romanian, but doesn't really speak Romanian. And every other sign points to the fact that this was the Russian government. So this is not spies are going to spy anymore. Spies usually don't leak what they know, right? If you're I'm not a spy, but if you're a spy, you just keep the secrets to yourself. You give them to your government, but you don't just like publish them all in the world. That's not how spying works. So this is a whole different game. This became quickly a disinformation campaign in which journalists and publications and even Wikileaks, perhaps the most famous leaking platform ever, were used as instruments of Russia's agenda. Here you can see there were like obviously hundreds of stories. So anyway, the leaks continue for weeks, and a month after Guccifer 2 appears, WikiLeaks finally starts publishing some of the emails hacked from the DNC. And Guccifer is very happy. He says, WikiLeaks has published my documents. He's probably very happy. He's drinking some Romanian alcohol probably, and he's celebrating this fact. Obviously, this becomes big news. Journalists like pore over the emails, through the emails, but actually, what's interesting after months looking back is that nothing really of substance comes out of these leaks. The only, there's some interesting stuff, but the really only relevant story at that point is that some officials in the Democratic Party seem to favor Hillary Clinton over Bernie Sanders during the primaries, which is kind of a big deal because obviously the Democratic Party is supposed to be neutral during the primaries. There's an unfolding scandal, and Debbie Wasserman Schultz, which you can see here in the middle, she was the head of the DNC at the time. She's forced to resign just the day before the convention. Anyway, big shitstorm, as we say, and the news of her resignation dominate the cycle. In the meantime, President Donald Trump is very happy. This is not a live footage of how he celebrated, but I want to imagine that he did celebrate that way. But anyway, this is not over. This is just the beginning. A few weeks later, Assange and WikiLeaks say that there's going to be more. And they promise an October surprise that's going to be timed. And it's October because it's right before the elections in the US, which were on November 7 last year. Anyway, for weeks and weeks, we speculate. People try to figure out what is this October surprise. People keep talking about it. Nobody knows. Then after a weird press conference in which Assange was supposed to give the October surprise, but then didn't because he was worried about he said that he was worried about getting shot. A few days later, WikiLeaks finally delivers the surprise. And as it turns out, someone sent Assange thousands of emails from John Podesta, from the email inbox of John Podesta. John Podesta is was one of the key figures of the Clinton campaign at the time. He was also a longtime member of the Democratic Party. He was basically a political insider, but a very big one. And on the same day, the US government comes out and officially accuses Russia of being behind the hack of the DNC, and also says that Guccifer 2 is just part of the whole campaign, as disinformation campaign. Here's a an excerpt of the actual statement from the US government. And this is a pretty big deal because the US government usually doesn't publicly accuse other governments of hacking. It's happened, before this, it only had happened twice with China and once with North Korea, and we'll talk about that later. But anyway, at this point, however, no one knows if the Podesta emails actually come from Russia. You know, this could be another hack, nobody knows. Anyway, the Podesta hack becomes a huge story. Everyone talks about it, but actually nothing really important comes out of it. And I spoiled myself here, but like, this is a great example, I think, of how non-important the actual leak was, because a lot of websites have to talk about is a risotto recipe, which I haven't tried, but if you're hungry later and you want to cook, apparently it's really good. So thanks to the hackers for that. So it takes a few weeks, but new data comes out and it reveals how Podesta was hacked. And we find out a little bit more about the story behind this. And it turns out that Podesta basically clicked on a phishing link, which is a very, very common way of hacking people. And it's very easy and it works basically all the time. So the interesting thing here, though, is that this new data shows a clear link between Guccifer, the DNC hackers, Fancy Bear, and another leaking website called WikiLeaks, which had come out a few weeks before and published some emails of American generals. Nobody really cared too much about WikiLeaks at that point, but basically a security firm showed that all these hacks were connected. All these characters had a common connection. In other words, everything is connected. The DNC hack, Guccifer 2, the Podesta hacks and leaks. So it's all part of Russia's influence campaign, or disinformation campaign, if you will. And at this point, there's a lot of evidence, and a lot of security companies and experts, as well as the US government, agree that this is all part of the same operation. In the meantime, well, I guess we should say at this point that it's unclear if Russia did this to favor Donald Trump. There's been a lot of speculation about that. I honestly don't believe that this was the case, at least at the beginning. The CIA says that that was the case, but it's just, I think that there's just no public evidence to clearly conclude that Russia just wanted to get Donald Trump in the White House. I think what it's clear, though, is that Russia wanted to attract attention, keep this story in the news, and create confusion. And that worked. And it worked because the people behind this whole operation used their own leaking channels, like Guccifer 2's tweets and website, the DC leak website, and more importantly, they got the most famous leaking website in the world, WikiLeaks, to get the attention. And WikiLeaks, over the years, has learned very well how to milk the attention of the press. And so they released the Podesta emails over days, over weeks, slowly, almost like as if they were dripping from a faulty faucet. Here you can see just some of the tweets that WikiLeaks sent out over those weeks. Nothing was stopping them from releasing all the emails in one batch, presumably. But they did it over days and days and days leading up to the election. And in this way, they kept the story in the news. Even if the emails themselves, as I said, they weren't really that newsworthy. Nothing really came out that was very interesting from the Podesta emails. So anyway, at this point, I think that it's important to make a point that this doesn't mean that Russia hacked the election. Also because hacking the election is doesn't really mean anything. I don't know what, it's a very generic term. And it's also impossible to know, if these leaks had any outcome, if they changed the outcome of the votes. Did they convince some people to switch sides? I mean, it's impossible to prove. But that doesn't matter in a way, because in a way, the hack worked because they hacked the press, they hacked the public, and they just kept this story in the news. So in other words, the operation was a success. And yeah, this is live footage from Putin after the operation. So what's interesting is that it's kind of funny that it's possible that Russia got inspiration for this operation from another hack that happened 3 years ago. That's also very famous. Obviously, it's impossible to know that they got inspired by this, but I think there are very clear similarities and links, and it's interesting to look at them. So this hack was the famous Sony hack, which we probably all remember. It was done by a group of hackers that called themselves Guardians of Peace, very cool name. And it turned out that they were actually probably North Korean, and not just North Korean teenagers, but hackers that worked for the North Korean government. This is back in November 24, 2014, so we're like 3 years before the DNC hack. And this is the message that appears on the computers of Sony Pictures employees in Los Angeles. Hacked by GOP, we've already warned you, and this is just the beginning. If you don't obey us, we'll release data shown below to the world. So the hackers are threatening to release a lot of data. GOP stands for Guardians of Peace, as I said, and the US government weeks later says that this is actually a group that works for North Korea. Anyway, in the days following the hack, the group comes through and fulfills its promise and starts publishing emails, documents, even like stolen movies that were not released before, never seen before scripts, private data of employees, all kinds of stuff that you can imagine. And just like the Podesta hack, the hackers published the data over weeks, over days, in stages, slowly. And just like the Podesta hack, the story stays in the news for weeks. Journalists go through the documents, there's a lot of news about it. But just like the Podesta leaks, the hack documents don't really reveal anything interesting. Or rather, they do reveal some interesting stuff. So, for example, there was this big story about how Sony paid female actresses less than male actresses. There was also the fact that Sony had concocted like a pretty sketchy way of fighting piracy by uploading fake movies. And also there was a story about Mark Zuckerberg trying to stop the Facebook movie, which, okay. I mean, it was a cool movie, but whatever. But in general, the coverage of the data was mostly, I think, gossipy. You know, I mean, this is Hollywood, a lot of gossip. It was almost voyeuristic, and I think it didn't really offer anything of public interest. And by the way, if you're wondering, Wikileaks has a little role in this story as well. It's a very small role, but a few weeks after the hack, they start publishing, they publish all the emails in an easily searchable way. Anyway, like what the Russians probably learned from this hack is that thirsty journalists are going to devour and cover anything they can from stolen emails and documents. In the case of the Sony hack, there was a little bit of everything in terms of like voyeuristic stories. There were stories that didn't have any public interest, articles that revealed information that should have probably been kept private. For example, these are just 3 examples of like kind of like dumb stories that we shouldn't really have known about. There was one point where a Sony producer called Angelina Jolie a spoiled brat. Obviously, she wasn't happy about it. George Clooney in an email joked about the fact that his email was going to be hacked. Kind of funny, but whatever. And then there was another one about Channing Tatum celebrating the fact that his movie was very successful. Okay, great. Congratulations. And the worst of all, I think, was this story that talked about the fact that the Sony president at the time, Amy Pascal, basically used to color her pubic hair, which, okay, but not really breaking news. So I think we can all agree that like these are just 3 examples, but these are not like important breaking news. And obviously, you know, journalism, you know, I think that the point here is that if an anonymous source had sent us some of these emails, probably we wouldn't not published any of them because, you know, who cares about this stuff, right? But, you know, since the emails were already out there, they were easily searchable, they got some coverage and everyone wrote about them. Of course, not all hacks and leaks are created equal, and some are actually more newsworthy than others. And almost ironically, sometimes they get less attention if they're not about Hollywood stars. What I'm talking about is the 2015 attack on Hacking Team. Some of you might know the company, but in 2015, a hacker or group of hackers, we don't know yet, called themselves Phineas Fisher, broke into the computers of Hacking Team and stole all kinds of data. By the way, Hacking Team is an Italian company that makes software to break into computers and spy on people, basically. Hacking Team says that they only sell to governments, and they sell to local police departments, intelligence agencies around the world. And by the way, if anyone from Hacking Team is here, I'm happy to get them a coffee afterwards or lunch. So you can find me here. Anyway, the hack on Hacking Team reveals a lot of stuff. The hacker basically stole everything from their computers. There's thousands of emails, internal documents, even the actual source code of the software that Hacking Team sells. And in total, the hacker releases 400 gigabytes of data, which is a lot of data. And the data reveals a lot of interesting stuff. First of all, and this just to make a quick flashback, Hacking Team was famous at the time because there have been a few cases where its software was used against activists, dissidents, and human rights people, and even journalists around the world. And this hack confirmed that Hacking Team had sold to these customers that were rumored before. And this was relevant because before the hack, Hacking Team never confirmed who their customers were. They always denied that they sold to Ethiopia or whoever. So with the hack, we found out the truth. These are some examples of the stories that came before the hack. So there were a couple of times where the Ethiopian government got caught hacking Ethiopian journalists in the US. There was the Moroccan government that used Hacking Team to hack a group of bloggers and stuff like that. So the hack confirms these stories, which is a big deal. And obviously, with all this data, there were even more shocking news. For example, we find out that Hacking Team had sold to Sudan, which I think in 2012 or 2011, at the time, Sudan was a blacklisted country by the United Nations. And not only Hacking Team sold to Sudan, but when the UN started looking into it, Hacking Team lied to the United Nations saying, we don't know what you're talking about. We never sold to Sudan, sorry. And we only know about this because the emails came out. There was also other stories like Hacking Team's equipment getting stolen in Panama, kind of a mysterious story. We never really found out exactly what happened, but at some point after the Panamanian elections, Hacking Team software got stolen and switches side. Nobody knows exactly what happened there. We also find out, going back to Ethiopia, we find out that Hacking Team was in fact the company behind those Ethiopian hacks. And when they found out about them, they kept the service. They never shut down the service, even though they got caught twice. And hacking team used to say that they had like a human rights council, that they looked into human rights concerns with their customers. But even though the researchers proved that Ethiopia was hacking journalists, hacking team didn't stop selling. Anyway, these are pretty shocking news at this point, but obviously not everything was newsworthy in this hack. There were 400 gigabytes of stuff, thousands of emails, and a lot of this was mundane, kind of boring, you know, office emails, like pretty boring stuff. There was also the fact that the source code was leaked was actually not a good thing for anyone, really, because it allowed criminals to reuse it, which actually happened later, and it just opened the door for more hacks. There was also a lot of personal data that should not have been there or should not have been published. You know, employees' passports, employees' private emails. There was a story about the fact that one of the hacking team employees seemed to like Russian prostitutes, which, you know, who cares? Not really anything that's probably should have been out there. So why did we talk about these 3 hacks? What's the point here? So these 3 hacks are interesting because even though they're different hackers, different targets, they can teach us the same things. And I chose to talk about these 3 hacks because there are 3 very good examples of what happens when a lot of data gets dumped on the internet and journalists have to react to it. And the way that journalists treated all this material is very similar. And it underlines emerging trends and challenges that I think we will all have to face in the future, because this is not going to stop. This is going to happen again. So the first challenge here is obviously the legal one, right? We get all this data, or someone leaks all this data. Is it fair game to write about it? Is it fair game to report on it? In the United States, the First Amendment is pretty broad and protects journalists in this way. So if you get the data and you did not participate in the act of stealing, it's fine. Like if you didn't actually hack the data, you can report on it. That's fair game. But just because it's legal, it doesn't mean that it's fair game, right? It doesn't mean that it's ethical to write about this data, and it's also probably not ethical to publish all the documents. And unfortunately also, from my experience with these 3 big hacks, it seems that the simple fact that they're out there, it just encourages journalists to be less critical about what they write about and what they decide is interesting. And they don't seem to be worried about the ethics of writing about something that can involve very private information. Think about the hacking team executive who liked Russian prostitutes, or the fact that Amy Pascal's uses beauty products for her pubic hair. So, I mean, this is, you know, right? Like, I think it's important to note that this was public information in the sense that it was out there. It was easy to find. Anyone with Google could have found it, right? It's in a website, but it's buried among millions of other documents, millions of other emails, thousands of data. And if we write an article about this, we increase the chances of this data being noticed. We're basically putting the spotlight on this particular story. So the question is, does it deserve the spotlight? And that's something that I think a lot of journalists didn't ask themselves during these stories. It's kind of weird that it seems that the fact that all this data is out sort of increases the chances that it's going to be written about. So there's like the competition from other outlets, the fact that everyone has access to all the documents. It sort of encourages a feeding frenzy where people write more and more about this story. This clearly happened with the Sony hack. It clearly happened with the DNC hack. And I have a feeling that sources, both hackers and leakers, are starting to figure this out, and they will take advantage of it. So they realize that it's easier to dump everything in public to get more attention, rather than just sending it to a journalist or a journalist organization for them to first vet and go through the documents and see if it's interesting. Also, the rush to write articles definitely discourages verification of the data. So I think it's very tempting when you see 400 gigabytes of data or thousands of emails, you just assume, okay, it has to be real. Who is going to create 400 gigabytes of data, right? Who could fabricate so much data? And that makes sense, but it's a dangerous assumption to make, because one day, one malicious source, be it Russia, be a teenage hacker, they will take advantage of it. To this day, I don't think there's been evidence that any of the documents that have come out in these 3 hacks, for example, there's no evidence that any of that was modified or faked. But it's impossible to know. One email could have been faked. And as journalists, we need to try to verify all the information we report and write about. Obviously, it's not always possible. Sometimes after these hacks, if you called up hacking team, they wouldn't even answer, obviously. If you called up the DNC, they also wouldn't comment. Same thing with Sony. Victims are they're smart about it too, and they're starting to realize that silence and refusing to confirm or deny or talk about at all is the best response, because this way journalists cannot say this email was definitely happened. This is a fact. But we still have to try to verify. We still have to call up the sources. It's our job. We need to trust but verify. And just seeing how much journalists have thirst for leaks, I think it's just a matter of time before a source tricks us into writing about a document or an email that was fake, and we end up writing something that is not a fact. And that could be dangerous. So I think that's why in some cases, even if the documents are out there, you have to drop the story. You just have to not write about it. And it sucks. Like sometimes you have a document, it sounds like an amazing scoop, but if you can't verify that it's true, you just can't write about it. And there's a good example of this recently. It's not a hack, but it was an interesting example of this kind of dilemma. We're again in the months leading to the election in the United States, and someone leaks a dossier or a report on Donald Trump prepared by a former British spy. The report basically looked into whether Donald Trump and his campaign had any links to Russia. And at this point, it's still like kind of a secret. It's like a silent, a secret that everyone knew about. The dossier was shared among a lot of journalists. The US intelligence had it. But since a lot of the claims in the documents were unverified and sometimes impossible to verify, a lot of organizations basically passed on it and decided not to do anything about it. Then after the election in January, CNN reports that American spies and the American intelligence apparatus basically has established that this report was credible enough that it was worth talking about it with Donald Trump and Barack Obama. And at this point, BuzzFeed decides to publish the whole dossier. I think it was 24 pages or 30 pages. And this happens in basically minutes. After the CNN story, CNN didn't publish the document. CNN only referenced to it, saying, we've seen these documents, but we're not publishing it. And BuzzFeed says, you know what, let's publish it. And, BuzzFeed, to their credit, they did say that this was mostly unverified, and a lot of the claims inside the report seemed a little bit almost crazy, to be honest. There was, for example, the fact that Trump had met with some Russian prostitutes, the fact that Russia had so much dirt on Trump that they could blackmail him. This was all obviously very juicy. If it was true, this was a big scandal, but there was no real way of knowing if it was true. But BuzzFeed published it anyway, and they got some criticism for it. But what they said was that they published it because basically this document had been seen by so many people at that point that they were like, if we've seen it, CNN has seen it, all other journalists have seen it, Americans and the world should see it too. And what they said was that was basically their reasoning, and this is what their full quote. They said, unlike traditional organizations that start by asking why they should share documents, BuzzFeed asks, why should we suppress this? And they said, it seems strange that the media elite knew about it and people at the highest forms of government knew about it, but didn't know what it was. At that point, it felt like, why does everyone get to see this except the public? Which is, I think it's fair. And I think we could argue for hours whether this should have been published or not. But the question here is, like, should readers always have access to the source material, right? We get a document, emails, whatever, a report. Do we have to publish it with our story? I think that it depends on the situation. And especially now in an age where false rumors, conspiracy theories, and what they call fake news seems to is so prevalent, I think that the answer to this question is crucial, and it's going to become really harder and harder to answer. The other problem with rushing to publish is that often journalists don't really ask themselves this one crucial question, which is this story in the public interest or not? In other words, why should readers know and care about this? Obviously, not all journalism has to discover incredible abuses or scandals. Not every article is like a Pulitzer Prize worthy article. We all write about, that's not the point. But I think that every story, every blog post, everything that comes out from us, from journalists, should always be somewhat useful to the public, right? We are talking to readers. Why should readers care about this? And sometimes, if the answer is they shouldn't, then we will have to sacrifice what are easy clicks or traffic for that. So what have we learned from all these hacks, and what can we do next? So at this point, the question is, what do we go from here? What should we do next time? And I think the first thing is we need to be more skeptical. When the next hack or the next leak happens, we should look at the data with a lot of skepticism and basically assume that it's all false. The second thing is we should think about who the source of the leak is. This doesn't mean that we should speculate who the source is. It doesn't mean that we should try to unmask the source. It doesn't mean that we should, if someone comes to us and says, I want to be anonymous, and we agree to that, we should stick to that and we should respect that wish. But there's a lot of cases where it's legitimate and good for sources to be anonymous. That's not what I'm trying to say. But just like we treat marketing from companies or government claims or anything else with skepticism, we should give the same skepticism to anonymous leakers and sources. We should treat their motives with skepticism, and we should wonder what's their motive here. Why are they giving us documents? Why do they want us to write about this? That's something we need to ask ourselves. Also, I think that we will have to restrain ourselves a little bit, because just because someone hacks the email account of a company or someone really interesting, a celebrity, or the president of the United States, it doesn't mean we have to write about what's in the emails. Because obviously emails, messages, there's always going to be juicy stuff in it. We all talk about private stuff. We all discuss stuff that we shouldn't talk about in public. But we have to ask ourselves, does the victim deserve to be, does their privacy deserve to be violated twice? Once by the hacker and once by our story. So be skeptical, be twice as careful as your sources are anonymous, and try to restrain yourselves. And also remember that, as journalists, we have basically a really big megaphone in our hands. And we have to use it wisely. Because if we don't, our readers will stop reading us, will stop respecting us, and eventually we will get out of business if that happens. So the big unanswered question is also like, how should we approach hacks and leaks that come from a government? Like in the case of the DNC hack, if it was really Russia, does that change anything? Does it change how we treat it? I think it's a very important question, and it's really hard to answer because this was the first example. And we will see more of it. I think that in the future, especially authoritarian governments or non-democratic governments will take advantage of our thirst for leaks, and they'll try to basically replicate what Russia is doing during they did during the election. It's just a matter of time. The biggest challenge, of course, is that sometimes we don't know who stole the documents, and sometimes the documents get leaked by whistleblowers who want to expose wrongdoing, or just like Edward Snowden, for example. So does the approach change? Does our criteria change if it's just a leak from a whistleblower and not a hack from a government? Leaking thousands or even hundreds of thousands of emails and documents in an anonymous way is easier than ever now. You don't have to meet in a parking lot. You don't have to call yourself Deep Throat. You don't even need to rely on WikiLeaks. All you need these days is an internet connection. A lot of news organizations now have anonymous, basically anonymous drop boxes where they can, when anyone can send data in an anonymous way. We have Secure Drop, Global Leaks, they're very similar. And everyone has this stuff now. The New York Times, BuzzFeed, Vice, Motherboard, my company, The Guardian, ProPublica, everyone has these kind of methods. So we'll see more of it. So in the future, it's possible that we will get more stuff and we will not know who sent it. Does that matter? Again, that's something that we need to ask ourselves. And in some ways, which it's what makes it really hard, it doesn't matter where the data comes from, because if it's true, it's probably worth reporting. But again, the usual rules of journalism apply. So given what happened with the DNC hack, we will have to be extra skeptical and extra restrained in dealing with leaked documents if there's a reason to believe they come from an authoritarian government that's just trying to push their agenda through naive journalists who, maybe they're not even naive, they just want clicks and they want to do their jobs. So be skeptical, be twice as careful, restrain yourself. And again, the real important question here is this story in the public interest? Should your readers care about this story? If the answer is no, then you shouldn't write about it. So someone made a really good point recently about this. His name is Thomas Reed. He's a professor at King's College, and he studied the DNC hack very closely. He's also studying Russian disinformation campaigns. And during a congressional hearing in the US, he basically said that journalists during the DNC hack were unwitting agents. He called them unwitting agents of Russian propaganda and disinformation. He said the journalists aggressively covered the political leaks while neglecting or ignoring their provenance, basically accusing journalists of not caring that this was coming from Russia and doing Russia's job. This is what he said during that congressional hearing. Yeah. So this is important because obviously this was the first time that a government used a hack to then leak information, but Russia has done something similar before during the Cold War. So Russia loves disinformation campaigns. That's something that it's not news. But what we've seen recently is that Russia also loves using journalists and their megaphones and WikiLeaks megaphone to amplify the message that they want to push and to manipulate the public. And it seems to work as long as no one knows that it's really Russia. And just to give you an idea of how long Russia has been doing this kind of disinformation campaign, This is a quote from 1980, so at this point almost 40 years ago. This is Ladislav Bittman, who is a Russian government defector that lives in the US now. He used to do disinformation campaigns for Russia during the Cold War, and he spoke at the US Congress, and he said, "The press should be more cautious with anonymous leaks. Anonymity is a signal indicating that the big Russian bear might be involved." This is again from 40 years ago, but if you read it now, it could just be, he could have just said it yesterday. So keep this in mind the next time you receive a stash of documents, a lot of emails through secure drop, global leaks, whatever. You know, maintain your skepticism, question your sources, and mind your megaphone. Thank you. And if we have time for a few questions, maybe? No time? Well, if you have some questions, you can find me at the end here.
Bravo. Bello. Ciao. Piacere, Carlo. Allora. Tu hai il computer con le slide, giusto? Sì.
Non è una presentazione però.
Però le slide, sì, abbiamo le slide, no? Le slide. Controllavo. Tanto siamo in un orario un po' sfigato. Dall'1 alle 2, poracci, anche noi.
Però anche vero che
Però era...
ti mangiano
in realtà,
gli scaglioni.
Sì, no, quello sì. Ma... perché anche scorne sono concentrati venerdì e sabato.
Solo oggi. Oggi è giorno.
È tutta una performance.
Avevo messo tutto impattato.
Io volevo parlare con lui. A parte vedo di persona.
Poi, can you come one second? Yeah. Sì, non so. Allora, io lo posso vedere, cioè, però.
Non lo puoi mandare fuori?
Um,
L'estensione perché deve essere duplicato.
ok. Okay. Problemi tecnici, of course. I have to say that it's a little bit strange to be here for me because 50 years ago, my grandfather, who was also a journalist, used to come to this very hotel when he worked at Paese Sera, a newspaper that's also dead. So it's almost like closing the circle. So after this, I'm retiring, basically. So that's great for me. After this, I'm done. Anyway, enough about that. Let's talk about, and hopefully this works now. Okay, we're going to talk about leaks today. Specifically, leaks about large leaks of documents and information originating from hacks or cyber attacks, if you want to use that word. Cyber attacks, I don't like that word very much, but that's another story. We'll talk about it next time. So we'll talk about the fact that there's been a dramatic increase in hacks and subsequent leaks in the last few years. And that's, I think, has changed the way that we do journalism. A brief warning, I have to tell you, I'm going to raise a lot of questions today, and we'll try to answer some of those, but I don't have all the answers. Of course, computers don't work when you need them to work. Interesting. Well, hi everyone. Sorry for the technical issues. Full screen, però. No, I block out. Vabbè, we'll do it. I think it's fine. We can do it like this. Lo so. I know. No spoilers. We don't like spoilers. Let's do it like this. This should be fine. We're hacking the computer live. Okay, I think this is fine. Okay, sorry for that. Hi everyone, buongiorno, welcome, and thanks for being here. I'm Lorenzo Franceschi-Bicchierai. I usually write about hackers, security, and digital rights for Motherboard, which is an online magazine, if you will, about tech and science. We're part of Vice Media. If you don't know Motherboard, I'm a little biased, but you should check it out. Before Motherboard, I was at Mashable, another website, and at Wired's Danger Room. If anyone remembers Danger Room, it was great. It's dead. Rest in peace. But before we begin, I would like to thank the organizers of the festival for inviting me, all the people that work really hard to make this happen. In particular, thanks to Claudia Agosti, who asked me to be here and brainstormed ideas with me on what to talk about. I also would like to thank my editor, Derek Mead, who encouraged me to be here, and thanks to my partner and Derek for helping me prepare this talk. Also,